On Christmas Eve 1872, 28-year-old Harriet Buswell, also known as Clara Burton, left her lodgings at 12 Great Coram Street, Russell Square in London, at around 10 o'clock in the evening. She had lived in the property for 4 weeks by this time, with her room costing 12 shillings a week, but that included attendance, breakfast and washing. She had borrowed a shilling from a fellow lodger, Mrs. Alice Nelson, then headed towards the Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square. She was wearing a black silk dress, a black velvet jacket, and a dark green brigand hat with a red feather in it. She had an 8-year-old daughter, Katie, but to make ends meet and to pay her debts, she worked as a sex worker in London's West End, although she told people she was a dancer in a theatre. Her young daughter had come to spend Christmas with her mother. From Berkshire, Harriet was described as pretty, polite, gentle, and had ladylike manners. Her parents were Henry and Isabella Buswell, who still lived in Berkshire at the time of her death. In the early hours of Christmas morning, she returned to her lodgings with a gentleman carrying a bag of fruit and nuts. She bumped into her landlady, Mrs. Harriet Wright, and paid her rent with a half-sovereign. The landlady gave her a shilling change. Then she asked for a little stout before she headed up the stairs to see her gentleman. The gentleman at this time had already gone upstairs to the second-floor back room, as if knowing where he was going. By Christmas afternoon, no one had seen Harriet. The decision was taken to break down the door to her room. It had been locked from the inside, and the key was missing. On the bed lay Harriet. Her throat had been cut, and the bed was covered in blood. A pair of jet earrings she'd borrowed, and her red Morocco purse containing the shilling change she'd received from the landlady were both gone. Also missing was a jet brooch and a pawn ticket from T.F. Cloud for 5 pairs of ladies' drawers, but in the name of Jane Wright. Lying on her bedside table was an apple with a bite out of it, and the jug of water was bloodied with the killer having washed his hands in it. No murder weapon was found. Dr. Murphy, who lived nearby, was called and pronounced her dead. He thought she'd been murdered while asleep, although one of her hands was raised, as though trying to defend herself. She also had a bloody fingerprint on her chin. He believed she'd been dead for between 8 and 10 hours before she was found, placing her death at between 3 and 5 o'clock in the morning. On Boxing Day, Harriet's body was taken to the St. Giles workhouse and was identified by her brother. On Friday 27th December, an inquest was held into her death, led by Dr. Murphy. There was no apple in Harriet's stomach, only a little lemon peel. Police were called at 1 p.m. on Christmas Day, and investigations got underway immediately, under the direction of Superintendent Thompson. They spoke to a greengrocer, George Fleck, and a waiter at the Alhambra restaurant called William Stalker, who'd both seen her in the company of the man seen going into the house. A reward of £100 was put up for any information about the murder, and they issued a description of the man they wished to speak to. He was around 25, was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and of a stout build. He had a swarthy complexion, with red spots on his face. He also had dark hair, described as black, and stubble from a few days of not shaving. He was wearing a dark-fitted coat, a dark billycock hat, and he spoke with a foreign accent, possibly German. This being the case, police became aware of a German ship docked at Ramsgate. The Wonderland was undergoing repairs after being stranded on the Goodwin Sands. On board was apothecary Karl Wohleber, and for some reason he became the prime suspect in the case. A lineup was arranged in the town hall there, and among those who made up their number was Dr. Gottfried Hessel. He was a Lutheran minister who was on his way to Brazil and had volunteered. To his and the police's astonishment, both Fleck and Stalker picked the doctor out as the man they'd seen with Harriet. Hessel and his wife, along with Wohleber, had all stayed at Kroll's Hotel in London over Christmas, and he vehemently denied having anything to do with Harriet's murder. On Tuesday, 21st January 1873, Dr. Hessel appeared before Magistrate James Vaughan at the Bow Street Police Court, charged with the wilful murder of Harriet. However, there was conflicting evidence. Fleck stated he'd sold fruit to the dead woman at around 1 a.m. on Christmas morning, his shop being open late due to it being Christmas. A man accompanying her waited outside, and he described him as a foreigner, pointing out Hessel as the man with her that morning. The gentleman had come into the shop as Harriet was taking so long, and asked him to buy her grapes, to which he replied gruffly, no. It was Fleck who handed the man an apple, the remains of which were found in Harriet's room. He was convinced the man had a German accent. Stalker too identified him, stating that he believed he was the man with Harriet in the restaurant on 24th December. However, the barmaid at the Alhambra told a different story. She had met Harriet and a man at the omnibus stop. The man had kept his eyes down until they alighted the omnibus, but she described him as a foreigner. She also stated that it was not the man in the dock, Dr. Hessel. Mary Neston, a maid in the house opposite number 51, had seen her gentleman caller leave the property at around 7 a.m, but there was no sign of the woman. When she'd heard what had happened, she went to the police station on Judge Street and reported what she saw. She described him as having a dark complexion, and he'd carried a walking stick. Staff at Kroll's Hotel verified that Hessel and his wife had been in the hotel at the time of the murder. That night, Hessel had drunk a cup of chamomile tea, then had headed to bed, suffering from a chest infection. His boots had been noticed sitting outside his hotel room door. 2 days later, the charges against the doctor were dropped. There was outrage at the treatment of the doctor, and the Daily Telegraph raised £1,200 for him and his wife before they set sail for Brazil. The Treasury also apologised to him, offering to defray the reasonable costs incurred in his defence, and also to provide the necessary funds for the passage fares to Brazil. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, also wished to express his sympathy for the painful position in which the doctor had been placed. Harriet Buswell was buried in Brompton Cemetery on 31st December 1872. Her murder remains unsolved to this day.